It is an honor to be here today. This feels like a historic moment. Some have come from afar to join us, such as the delegation from Gallaudet University, which we need the interpreters for. And as our invincible tech team comes to help us, I'll give a shout out of thanks to Ben, Sean of the tech team, Alice and Allison of the Dean's office for helping make this happen, the SIS Hub team for making this happen, as well as our co-sponsors, the Abdel Aziz Chair of International Peace and Conflict Resolution, the Peace, Human Rights, and Cultural Relations Department generously co-sponsored this, the Ethnographies of Empire Research Cluster. We also want to thank the PhD program for assistance with sign language interpreters, and the sign language interpreters themselves, Susan Wells and Wendy Rossi. And thanks also to PhD students Kanika Varna and Akanksha Jain for assistance with visuals over here. This is a tightly curated slideshow that we have on this wall so as to allow the interpreters on this wall for maximum information, but also a way for us to keep together as we think through visually and orally what's happening right now in Palestine. So our panel today consists of introductory remarks, starting with Professor Mohammed Abu-Nimer, who has taught at SIS since 1997, a globally renowned, award-winning leader in the field of interreligious peace building. Professor Abu-Nimer now serves as the inaugural Abdel Aziz Chair of International Peace and Conflict Resolution here at AU School of International Service. Palestinian himself, he was supposed to be in Ramallah this week, right now, zooming in, but flights have been canceled due to Israeli attacks underway in Lebanon, so he joins us in person. After Mohammed, we have Professor Malini Ranganathan, political ecologist, geographer, and faculty in the Department of Environment, Development, and Health. As a co-organizer of this panel with me, Professor Ranganathan analyzes the environmental apartheid long underway in Palestine, now exploding into outright ecocide, as well as its dire health impacts and geopolitical implications. Next, we have Professor Ken Conca, also of EDH Department. For several years, Professor Conca co-taught a field-paced graduate practicum in Palestine, working on water issues with Palestinian and Israeli peace organizations. He has also served on an advisory board for Eco-Peace Middle East, a regional organization linking Jordanians, Israelis, and Palestinians working for water sustainability and climate adaptation. I will be speaking next. I'm a scholar of agricultural policy and geopolitics of food. My name is Garrett Graddy-Lovelace, I forgot to mention that. And I'll be giving remarks on the famine conditions in Gaza, the weaponization of food and hunger, and Palestinian geographies of food sovereignty. Finally, Professor Anthony Wanis-St of the Peace, Human Rights, and Cultural Relations Department will give comments on the failure of the negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza. Anthony is of Middle Eastern, including Palestinian heritage, and his book, Back-Channel Negotiation, analyzes Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, and he also held the Palestinian American Research Center postdoctoral fellowship. We then open our conversation up to you all, the audience, whom we very much look forward to hearing from. I know there's a lot of knowledge in this room, and we look forward to a dialogue. Please hold your questions until after the panelist, and then we'll have a half an hour or so for formal Q&A, and then a more informal hour to half an hour to 5:30 to continue our dialogue. Finally, this is the beginning of a series of events on Palestine this academic year at SIS. So please mark your calendars for October 29th, right here at the Founders Room from 4 to 6 p.m. for a panel called Dissent from Within, Ethics and the War on Gaza, organized by Professor Tazrina Sajjad of SIS, with a stellar and very full lineup of ex-officials in the US government who have resigned from the Biden administration in the past year in conscientious objection to the US's role in Israel's war on Gaza. So that's October 29th. And now, intros over, we start the content. We today are gathered to bear witness, to not talk about the atrocities underway in Gaza, to resist the silence and affirm the reality of Palestine as a place, and as a people, with layered history and intricate geography, long beleaguered and besieged, yet now facing apocalyptic conditions. We bear witness to the horror of Gaza's relentless bombardment, starvation, dehydration, and the horror that these violences are not accidental, but intermixed with Israeli forces' deployment of executions, assassinations, carceral surveillance, imprisonment, torture, chemical warfare, and the targeting of even safe zones and humanitarian corridors. We bear witness to the fact that we must proactively bear witness, since this nightmare falls in and out of the news cycle, warped by media bias and warmongering headlines. We have a particular responsibility to bear witness here at a School of International Service in Washington, D.C., the axis of US's alleged leverage with the Israeli government, yet from where the tens of billions of dollars in weapons transfers get reauthorized again and again. So we start with the word and reality of Palestine in our title. Then we move on to focus on ecologies, not in the sense of an environment out there, but as interrelated human and beyond human life systems, the web of living things, the material reality of how water, food, air comprise health, how their lack or toxicity confers ill health and death. Ecologies as the social and spiritual realities of connection to land and land-based identity. Then we name genocide in our title. This is the heaviest of words. Israeli scholars like Raz Segal and Omar Bataf used the word even last fall. And in December of 2023, 55 experts issued a statement, "We, scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence, feel compelled to warn of the danger of genocide and Israel's attack on Gaza." And then, of course, last winter, South Africa brought an extensive case against Israel to the International Court of Justice, which decided in January that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. Over a dozen countries have since signed on to the historic ICJ case. The University Network of Human Rights, an international consortium, conducted a thorough legal assessment of Israel's military action in Gaza since the fall of 2023, after the horrific Hamas attacks in October, and concluded in a May 2024 report that indeed Israel had violated the Genocide Convention in its reactions to the attack. Even as we speak at the UN General Assembly, world leaders today demand Israel end its assault on Gaza, which many label genocide, and its current attacks on Lebanon. The health ministry has confirmed 42,000 people, human souls, killed in Gaza Strip alone by Israeli forces since October, but we know that tens of thousands more are still missing under the rubble. Tens of thousands more are so massacred and dismembered they've become unrecognizable body parts. The esteemed public health journal The Lancet estimated in July that there's up to 135,000 deaths attributable to the war on Gaza. If violence continues, this could be more. And of course, there's many more examples of people using that word, and we're sitting with the heaviness of that word, and we do not use it lightly. So even as we think through that word, we're also thinking through talks of freedom, which is the final word of our title. And as we think through the complex injustices required, injustice that we're grappling with, it requires proactively countering Islamophobia, anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Semitism, which we roundly condemn. We must counter all of them together because they feed off each other in vicious cycles of disinformation atop years of systemic dehumanization. So we end with the word freedom, freedom from anti-Semitism, freedom from anti-Palestinian racism, and freedom for Palestine, in the short term for their survival, to live, drink water, eat food, receive medical care, hug their children, have shelter and safety from 2,000-pound bombs, but also freedom in the long term to have sovereignty, the foundation for any lasting peace in the region and thus in the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and sharing with us this event and gathering. It's a pleasure to be with you all. My task, as Garrett said, is to lay the ground for the context. And in my mind, there's two questions. One is what are the changes in the dynamic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that facilitated the genocide to take place? What has happened here? Is it really something that different took place in this context? And maybe toward the end, if I have time, some things that we could do in order to help and support, prevent the further escalation and further the war. But let me first speak to you from a nonviolent resistance perspective, one that denounces violence in the name of any identity, sexual identity, gender, nationalism, or religion. I believe that all forms of violence should become a taboo. That all forms of militarization and weaponization of identities should be rejected by all people, exactly like we reject and resist any harm to our own immediate family, and we consider that a taboo. That is what I believed in. That is what I worked for over 4 decades in my life, and that's what I have dedicated my work to. The context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has some basic features that did not really change, and we need to remember them in order for us to understand the container, the context that allowed this to happen. This is a conflict over land and over self-determination rather than religion. The Palestinian demand for national independence and territorial sovereignty, this is the core thing so far in the conflict. Since 1948, Israeli government, with the support of its allies, American and European government, have prevented the creation of Palestinian state on any part of historic Palestine. There is an Israeli apartheid occupation over the land of 1967, and the system has all the features of apartheid and colonization of land. Since 1967, increasingly the Jewish settlement created a fact on the ground, left only 23% of the size of historic Palestine exists right now. In the past 75 years since Israel was created, the Palestinian liberation movement, regardless of their ideology, and the faction have always been labeled as terrorists, regardless what mechanism they use for resistance. This has been used to delegitimize any call for independence and for freedom. The ideology of the Israeli government since 1996, when Netanyahu also was there, is based on several principles: no right for land for the Palestinian, no Palestinian state, no equal rights for non-Jews. This is a state for Jewish people only, and non-Jews do not necessarily belong there, as Netanyahu have stated in several occasions this year. Oslo is dead. The peace agreement is dead, and there is no way to resuscitate that at this point. Palestinians found themselves in the past few years in desperate and hopeless context. Arab governments are normalizing relationships with Israeli occupation. Palestinian Authority is not effective in protection, and increased settlement, daily attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque, and increased military and security raid against Palestinian city. Simply unbearable life condition for Palestinians up to recently as well. The current Israeli government, the 2 years old now, this one at least, is in the process of executing an ethnic cleansing plan to depopulate the Palestinian territory. That's clear from 2020 at least, when they were in power, many of them. I believe that October 7 attack on Israeli civilian is horrible and should not be justified, regardless whether it's done by Hamas fighters or others who managed to enter the Israeli settlements during that day. That's sort of the general context of this conflict. Now, in terms of what has changed, is really some change here or not? For the past 2 years, the major change that Israeli government is run and controlled by ultra-religious right-wing leadership, Beni Gvir and Smotrich, who believe that they should finish or end the conflict. Speeding the end of the conflict is a religious duty and historic opportunity now, because this is the first time in 75 years of the State of Israel that expulsion and ethnic cleansing discourse has become formally governmental and mainstreamed. And it at least endorsed, and I'm very underestimated by 50% of the Israeli public who voted for this government. Therefore, instilling fear and intimidation among Palestinians by incitement, provocation, escalation are tools to speed up this conflict, drive the conflict to a point of expulsion, then implement depopulation, transfer, expulsion plans. The Hebrew slogan right now in Israel is to launch total war to defeat the enemy once and for all. And you, the generation of the Israeli soldier now, can do that. That the message has been given to the Israeli soldier by the beginning of the war in October 7. As a result of this, the conflict escalated and has spiraled to reach genocidal scale, but still utilizing the same dominant ideologies, discourses that have shaped the relationship between early Zionist settlers and Palestinian indigenous population since 1880s. The current phase of this conflict has also taken a new dimension, religious dimension. The right-wing Israeli government, being dominated by religious Zionist ministers and parties, have increasingly framed the conflict as religious, biblical, while Hamas and Hezbollah, of course, continue to utilize the religious ideology in justifying their response and also fight. This dimension is directly feeding the belief that it's either us or them, and there is no other option. This mentality paved the way to genocidal campaign in Rwanda, in many other cases, in the Balkan, in many other areas, and Israel existed in this. There are 5 fundamental principles that underline the politics of this conflict from early on stages, and they basically prepare this, and they facilitated the offense of the Israeli army in Gaza and now as well in Lebanon. They are the ones that facilitate the attempt to kill 5,000 people in 1 minute through the pagers. Doing that is accepted, legitimized within Israel and outside with the community. That require some infrastructure for genocide mentally to exist. I facilitated hundreds of dialogue groups between Israeli and Palestinian, Israeli Jews as well as Palestinian and Israel, inside and outside. I have patiently listened to the fears and security of the participants and help them form personal relationships to humanize the other. Some of these relationships were sustained and managed to overcome the repeated cycles of violence between the two sides. In every encounter, it always boils down to the capacity of the Israeli and Palestinian to find ways to overcome the following 5 principles. If you manage to overcome them, then they can form relationship. The first principle that facilitated this environment is that Palestinians are subhuman. They're not equal to the Israeli Jews. Palestinians find themselves fight for their humanity. The dehumanization message that Israeli government and large public discourse has sent since the attack of October 7 has been against Palestinians, Hamas, and Gazan as subhuman, and their lives are not as valued as Israeli Jewish foreign lives. The United States government and European governments have endorsed that, complacent, and has been silenced on the dehumanization of life of Palestinian. 4 ways in which this has been manifested since October 7 and even before. 1, depersonalization of Palestinian victims. We don't know them, we don't know their name, they're just numbers in that sense. Debating the number of victims in Palestinian side, always according to Palestinian Ministry of Authority, but always accepting the Israeli numbers as well. Palestinian children and women prisoners, when they were released, if you notice, they were not allowed to celebrate their release. The Israeli prisoners who were hostage were released. They were broadcast live stream globally as celebrating their release. Humiliation and deprivation of human dignity constantly throughout the 75 years been practiced. Palestinians today are not fighting for their lives and physical survival only, but for their sense of human dignity and humanity. Second discourse construct, moral, cultural, and religious superiority. Since its inception, Zionist ideology have established its principle on a Jewish moral superiority in comparison to Palestinian indigenous who lived in the land. Land without people to people without land. Therefore, the Zionists presented themselves to Western colonial power in early 1900 as superior people who will bloom the desert, bring modernity and democratic value to the primitive locals. This is in the discourse of the literature as well. That was very fitting and sync with the European colonization period. The Zionist ideology of superiority over indigenous inhabitants of the land manifested in every strategy of dealing with Arabs. And it has been fed generation to generation in Israeli right-wing Zionists who are today in control and facilitating the genocide. I have lived 27 years in Israel with Israeli citizenship. I have felt this so many parts in my own personal life and so many relationships. Denigration of Palestinian and Arab pride cultural norm is a normal practice in Israeli governmental institution and also among individuals. The third construct, ideology of superior military power as an effective form of deterrence. The assumption that Arabs and Palestinians only understand the language of violence and force. The more advanced the weapon system, pagers, walkie-talkie blowing, the more secure Israel will be and the less secure the Palestinian will be. That construct has brought more insecure for Palestinians and become defenseless, and therefore Israel needs to be more secure. We have seen this manifested in early Zionist ideology in the Iron Wall in 1925 by Jabotinsky, one of the founders of the right-wing Zionism in the history of this conflict. The fourth construct, weaponization of historic victimhood and anti-Semitism in the fight against Palestinians. Norman Finkelstein, Chomsky, Elam Pepe, and others stated that catastrophic event of the Holocaust has been weaponized against and again by Israeli government and many affiliate institutions to suppress and silence the moral critique of Israeli occupation or apartheid. We, the victim of the Holocaust and our descendant, cannot be held accountable for war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, or any violation of human rights. The same logic has been utilized heavily since October 7. The Israeli Jewish victimhood is superior to any other form of Palestinian victimhood. Recognizing Palestinian victimhood will perceived as negating and detracting from the sense of Israeli Jewish victimhood. Any form of critique of Israeli policy has to be scrutinized first by the anti-Semitism lenses and the Jewish Holocaust. Finally, the fifth principle. International law, international human rights, international media and the press institution are irrelevant and have no legitimacy in dictating moral or international legal norms, delegitimize them and destroy their credibility. An assumption that has been practiced during October. You just look at how many press people has been killed. In the dynamic of this conflict, these five fundamental principles or ideological construct have been deployed in the Israeli conflict again, and that's what really facilitated the genocide today. Without going into the numbers, because some of my colleagues will talk about this, today we see the narrative of the two sides back to the existential trauma of Holocaust and Nakba. We thought that Oslo Agreement has overcome this fear. I'll suggest 4 things that we could do, and I'm happy to answer also in the Q&A. One, what we could do as outsider and also people who are in solidarity with this situation. One, to engage in humanizing actions between Palestinians and Jews on continuous basis. There is no way around that. Transform the education, media, and socialization agency in both sides to focus on a humanization of the other side. Insist on equal and preserving a human dignity in each interaction between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Palestinians as well. As an outsider, we describe, diagnose, and analyze this conflict. We have to insist on this human equality. As outsider, we refrain from injecting further weapons. 15,000 tons of explosive the US gave to Israel as of today. Naming injustice and our responsibility as peacemakers, and we stand as allies with each other. Being silent is an act of complacency. When we are silent on anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or Palestinian phobia on our campus or on our community, we are hurting ourselves too. The best way to support Israel and Palestinian in this conflict is to insist on peace and justice on the base of equal dignity and the freedom for all people from the river to the sea, and not only for one side. For today, I think the best thing we could do is to call for immediate ceasefire and to delegitimize the continuation of a genocide and the war on Gaza and Lebanon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. In addition to all of those people that Garrett thanked in her opening, I would like to extend my deep gratitude to all the students, the alum, and even members of the community that are not from AU that are here today, from the wider DC region. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for bearing witness with us. And thank you for refusing to be silent in the face of the ongoing annihilation of Palestine and now the war on Lebanon, perpetrated by Israel and financed and armed by the United States. As I sat down with a heavy heart to think through what to say today, I found it difficult to know where to start. There is an Arabic word, ghussa, which translates into a lump in your throat, maybe because you have something stuck there, but also an unspeakable sadness and anxiety that chokes you, prevents you from speaking, from even breathing. That is how I feel right now, ghussa. How does one know where to start when slaughter after slaughter by the Israeli military make it such that we do not even know if the news about another Gazan hospital being flattened, another university decimated, another safe corridor bombed, another set of children burned to chars is the news from today or from 3 days ago? Flower massacre, tent massacre, safe corridor massacre. Blink and you may miss another massacre. Blink, and you may miss Blinken spinning again. But I realized that as I was bearing witness to the genocide, domicide, scholasticide, and ecocide that are ongoing, what is important for me to communicate to you as a professor is the following. When we talk about ecologies of genocide in Palestine, it is not solely the fast violence of post-October 7th that has destroyed and contaminated Palestinian water, trees, agriculture, soil, air, beaches, and health systems that we must foreground. It is also the slow ecological violence, the deliberate and decades-long harm and killing of Palestinians through ecology that we must talk about. This slow violence via colonial logics of occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing date to the Nakba in 1948 and have intensified since 1967. In 1944, Polish Jewish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin defined genocide not necessarily as mass killing, but, quote, as a coordinated plan aimed at destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups, so that these groups wither and die like plants that have suffered a blight. It is not coincidental that Lemkin used a plant metaphor to talk about genocide. Indeed, legions of Palestinian and Israeli historians have shown that slow genocide via ecology in Palestine is a generational process that far predates October 7th. It is the seizing of land, of the most fertile land in the West Bank. It is the ever-increasing New Jersey-style settler suburbs in the West Bank in total contravention of international law. It is the uprooting of olive trees, citrus trees, and carob trees by settlers and replacement by European pine trees. It is Israel's ongoing land, sea, and air blockade of Gaza, preventing entry even of tools to repair sanitation infrastructure, leaving Gaza awash with waterborne diseases and salination well before October 7th. It is the disproportionate dumping of industrial affluence by Israel in the West Bank, a textbook case of what scholars in my fields would call a sacrifice zone or an environmental racism. These practices are the slow and everyday genocide I want to highlight. Palestinian scholars have a special term for this. They call it eco-colonialism. What is eco-colonialism? For Shuride Molavi, writing in her 2023 book, Environmental Warfare in Gaza, Colonial Violence and New Landscapes of Resistance, eco-colonialism describes the processes by which Israel simultaneously corners ecological resources to subordinate indigenous Palestinians and remakes the landscape to erase Palestinian identity and belonging. Nowhere is this eco-colonialism more obvious than in the systematic war on trees that Israel has waged against native Palestinian species in the past century, often through the ruse of making the desert bloom, which is a greenwashing tactic that glorifies European tree species planted over the ruins of Palestinian villages. I've been thinking a lot about Rachel Corrie. Rachel Corrie, the 23-year-old American who was crushed by an Israeli Caterpillar US-made bulldozer in 2003 at the height of the Second Intifada, while she was protesting the illegal demolition of Palestinian homes in Rafah, used to email her mother and father back in the US regularly. She emailed her mother just a few days before she was crushed to death. Allow me, friends, to quote her email, for it reveals the ecological violence she witnessed firsthand. February 27th, 2003, from Gaza. Mama, if any of us had our lives and welfare completely strangled, if any of us knew because of previous experience that soldiers and tanks and bulldozers could come for us at any moment and destroy all the greenhouses that we had been cultivating for however long, and did this while some of us were beaten and held captive with 149 other people, do you not think we might try to protect whatever fragments of our lives remained? She continues, I think about this, Mama, especially when I see orchards and greenhouses and fruit trees destroyed. Years of care and cultivation. I think about you and how long it takes to make things grow, and what a labor of love it is. Shortly after Rachel was killed by the IDF in 2003, I found myself coincidentally living with Rachel's cousin, Gina, in Berkeley, California. Gina and I were both doing our PhDs together. It was that year, and it was through hearing about young Rachel's bravery, the Eisenhower Agi of my generation, that I became activated to unlearn all the silences, all the half-truths, all the greenwashing, and all the whitewashing that I'd heard about Israel and Palestine. As has been well documented in peer-reviewed academic journals and university press books, Israeli environmental organizations have partaken in greenwashing efforts aided by American donations and its charitable tax-exempt status. For instance, the Jewish National Fund. Palestinian scholar Ghada Sasa, writing in the 2023 peer-reviewed academic journal Politics, says that these environmental groups like the JNF, have aggressively reforested the landscape with acidic pine trees atop the detritus of Palestinian homes. She writes that pine trees were specifically chosen to make the landscape look more European and to eliminate all traces of Palestinian heritage. But there is a dark side to this eco-colonialism that is much more difficult to greenwash, namely toxic colonialism. According to Bat Salem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, Israel encourages the transfer of various types of toxic waste to the West Bank, including sewage, infectious medical waste, used oils, solvents, metals, e-waste, and batteries. Israel gives tax breaks for waste facilities to operate in the West Bank, and because it is occupied territory, can set lower environmental standards there. So this longer history of toxic colonialism, this longer history of impunity that the international legal and environmental community has sadly neglected, is now playing out in real time on the Gaza Strip. In addition to the 37 million tons of debris generated by the obliteration of over 70% of Gaza's housing stock since October 7th, an amount that could fill the entirety of New York City's Central Park over 8 meters high. The bombing in Gaza has had catastrophic effects on the soil, water, and air. The chemicals released by the bombs, a force greater than all the bombs dropped on Dresden, London, and Hamburg in World War II, and the chemical dust thrown up by the asbestos in the debris. All of this is to say nothing about the chemicals released by decomposing flesh and untreated fecal matter. All of this is poisoning Gaza to a level that public health experts don't even know how to fathom. The picture is, in short, bleak, not at all helped by university administrators and elected officials crying anti-Semitism when students and faculty utter the truth of the matter. We are well past the time for a ceasefire. We must have an immediate arms embargo and sanctions on Israel as called for by the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago. In closing, let us ask ourselves, why do so many people from Mexico to Japan to India, all of my friends and family in India, 100% of them, identify with the Palestinian struggle for freedom? The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, said it right when he said at the UNGA 2 days ago, when Gaza dies, all of humanity dies. People have identified with Palestinian liberation because they see that the causes of this genocide, unchecked militarism, crony capitalism, colonial impunity, racism, dehumanization, are the same causes fueling the destruction of humanity and the planet more generally. As I wrote with colleagues at the Climate and Community Institute in the December 2023 report, and you can access the report from the right-hand side of my AU page, there is no climate justice in a world in which Palestinians are bombed, starved, and displaced from their lands. There is no climate justice in a world where Palestinians do not have self-determination and freedom. So come, let us swallow the collective sadness in our throats. Come, let us be compassionate and unafraid intellectuals, exactly as Edward Said would have wanted us to. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. This is an important conversation. There are half a dozen seats down front. It's great to see a room, standing room only, but if anybody feels the need to sit, there are a half a dozen seats. Please don't be shy about grabbing them. I'm going to talk about water, because it's what I know about in the region. And I guess the first question that has to be addressed is why talk about water? Given the systematic destruction that we've seen, given the shocking violence that we've seen, it almost feels like a distraction to talk about water. But I think there's a couple of reasons why it's extremely important to do so. The first is that the story of water traces an arc historically of dispossession, of vulnerability, of structural violence that allows us to put the current moment in context. And the second reason is that water has been weaponized in this conflict. We use terms like genocide and war crimes. Sometimes we use them loosely. Sometimes we hurl them at each other as a form of invective. We weaponize them. Sometimes we try to use them as a basis for dialogue. But what I want to stress is they're also legal judgments. They are adjudicated based on a body of evidence and a statutory standard. And so very much in solidarity with Mohammed's statement that one of the principles that has to be transcended here is impunity, is lawlessness, is the inapplicability of international law. There are characteristics around what's happening with water today that can build that adjudicated case so that one hopes there can be some accountability. I'll return to that theme in a moment. But first, just give a very quick tour of a very complex history. The historical experience of water for the Palestinian people has a few core foundational elements. The first is displacement. When the modern state of Israel was carved out in 1948, the Nakba, the dislocation of 800,000 Palestinians, many of them ended up in Gaza. Much of the population of Gaza, 3/4 or more, are refugees or trace their lineage through that refugee experience. This means farming communities, for the most part, that had adequate water supplies to pursue their livelihoods, pushed into a strip of desert that has not one single body of surface water. There is not a natural lake or river in the Gaza Strip, just a shallow aquifer that is desperately overexploited. We've seen a parallel process on a more incremental measures in the West Bank with the land displacement of Palestinian farmers, with Israeli settlements diverting water, and with Israeli security arrangements enhancing that denial of access. Palestinians have no access to the Jordan River because the entire corridor of land along the Jordan River is defined as Area C, a highly securitized zone. And so despite the importance of the Jordanian River to Palestinian historical culture, there is no access to the river. But it's not just displacement and denial of access. It's also the distinct, uneven historical and unequal historical development of water resources and an infrastructure for water resources. When Israel was founded in 1948, one of the early national strategic priorities was the development of a national water carrier. And the company, Mekarat, that was created, developed two really important capabilities: the ability to tap groundwater supplies and the ability to move surface water from where it was abundant in places like Lake Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee, further to the south, where it was a strategic priority to settle Israelis and develop agriculture. That was an impressive accomplishment for Israel, and it led to rapid, if I would argue, unsustainable agricultural growth. But the story of that for Palestinians was very, very different. So, for example, the massive diversion of water from Lake Tiberias has distinct consequences for Jordanian and Palestinian and Israeli communities downstream from the lake, and has accelerated the death of the Dead Sea. Palestinians, in contrast, have systematically seen their capacity to develop water infrastructure stifled and stymied and curtailed. It's very hard to properly site a sewage treatment plant in the West Bank because that is considered an Israeli security concern. And so they get pushed much closer to the population centers than any engineering or public health analysis would suggest they should be placed. It's very difficult to import equipment to keep that sewage treatment plant running, or to keep a water quality testing facility or a water treatment plant running. Even putting a pipe under a road for drainage can be considered a security threat. Imagine trying to sustain, forget the bombardment, imagining during times of quietude trying to sustain a functional water infrastructure under those sorts of conditions. The last time I was in the West Bank, I stood in a farmer's field and listened to him tell me a story. He was fortunate to have an artesian well, naturally pressurized well, that dated back to the Jordanian era. So he didn't fall under some of these securitized regulations, and he was allowed to operate his well. He needed to move that well 20 yards further on his own land to deal with the changed pressurization because of a nearby settlement and its use of water, and he couldn't move his own well on his own land. Those are the conditions of water infrastructure. In Gaza, the consequences of this combination of displacement and disabling of capacity has led to overexploited groundwater, because the only source, other than purchasing water from Israel, which I'll speak to in a moment, is a shallow aquifer that was once written about as having a particularly sweet quality of water, but today is highly saline because of the saltwater intrusion from the Mediterranean and because of the overexploitation. So Gazans live by overexploiting groundwater and by purchasing water from Israel. Desalination, which has been absolutely transformative and is a significant Israeli achievement in the water sector, would be an appropriate solution for Gaza, but it's too easy to target, and so it can't be built. Israel does sell water to Palestine through the Oslo Accords of 1995, and as far as I can tell, has met its treaty-based commitments to provide that water. But it's a capped amount of water from an agreement in 1995 that was supposed to lead within 5 years to a two-state solution. Instead, 3 decades later, and with more than double the population, that's still the capped amount of water that is provided by Israel. On top of that, repeated episodes of bombardment. We're focused on today, and this has taken it to a new order of magnitude, obviously, but 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. The Climate Environment Observatory, a London-based civil society group that does excellent work on this, identified after the 2021 bombardment 290 water infrastructure objects, right? Think a treatment plant, think a stretch of pipeline, think of pumping that had been destroyed in the bombardment. Many of those were never repaired, or were only superficially repaired because of the difficulty of getting the parts through the blockade that has existed for 17 years now. As a result, Gaza was already teetering on the edge before the current onslaught of the past year. Gazans consume an average of 89 liters per person per day. You may well have used that in the shower this morning if you were a little bit indulgent in the shower that you chose to take. That's for washing, that's for drinking, that's for cleaning, that's for cooking. Also extremely poor water quality standards. One recent study found that 96% of the tested, sorry, the fly doesn't deal with it, will you?
I got it.
Back to the story. A recent study found that 96% of the sites tapping groundwater failed basic World Health Organization standards. In the past year, what we have seen added to this is the active weaponization of water. And that's been done in at least 3 different ways. The first is the manipulation of water supplies as a tool of Israel's strategy of warfighting. After October 7th, water was cut off entirely. There are 3 main pipelines that come into Gaza. Water was cut off entirely for a week. The flow was then restored, but it was only partially restored and only to the south. And this was obviously part of a strategy of forcibly moving Gazans out of the north so that this sort of phased north to south invasion that had been planned could proceed. So that's one way we see the weaponization of water. A second way that we see the weaponization of water is in the obstruction of aid. Now, we've all heard the stories about food, about water, and about medication, but it's also about equipment. One small example, Oxfam was trying to bring 3 small desalination units into Gaza. These are very important because of the salinization of the water supply, and many people rely on very small-scale means of water treatment to get the water to the best quality that they can get it to. Oxfam was bringing in 3 small desal units and some pipes. They had to spend several months going through just the pre-clearance phase. And as of July, which is the last account I have, those units have still not arrived in Gaza. The third way water has been weaponized, and the last point, and I won't go into detail here, is the destruction of essential infrastructure. 84% of the water production capacity, 70% of the sewage pumps, both water quality testing labs, all the wastewater treatment plants have been destroyed. We're seeing a lot of evidence just in the last year from the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and you can ask me about this in the Q&A because I'm told I have to stop, that water is starting to be linked conceptually in distinct ways to potential adjudication around genocide and around war crimes. There are material facts about water. You can measure the flow, you can photograph the destruction that make it possible to put together a body of evidence for that adjudication. There's some very interesting organizations. The Geneva Water Hub is the first place to go if you're interested in that specifically, that are trying to document legitimate methodologies for telling that story so that it will stand up in an adjudicative proceeding. Thank you very much.
Hear me? Yes. All right. I think I'll stay seated so that if you do want to gaze to your left, you can see some of the images here which pertain to some of my comments. You don't have to strain too much, but they're there for you. So, friends, let's talk about empirics. Millions of Gazans have been suffering extreme food deprivation for nearly a year. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification is an international data synthesis instrument with 5 phases. 1 is normal, 2 is stressed, 3 is crisis, 4 is emergency, and 5 is catastrophe famine, rarely used. The IPC reports on the Gaza Strip released recently represent, to us who study food systems, the abyss. The ominous deep red color of the map that you'll see soon, and the gray lines shading half of the Gaza Strip represent half of the population at level 5. This is the nightmare that all who enter food studies work entered to prevent. The whole apparatus of the IPC, of the UNFAO, the food aid agencies, the elaborate famine early warning systems, the hunger research institutions, the whole sector have as their purpose the prevention of this. The whole thing is supposed to be a warning system, and the warnings have gone off. They've been going off. The red flags, the alarm bells have been ringing, and yet have remained muted in the halls of power where we are. Once children suffer Category 5 extreme acute malnutrition, they begin stunting, wasting, and have lifelong developmental and cognitive harm and increasing rates of starvation mortality. Even if the food aid comes immediately, many will not survive or will have lifelong deleterious impacts. So this problem seems far off geographically, and from our media standpoint, rarely talked about, and yet we sitting here in Washington, D.C. are deeply involved. And with our government's ignoring of the mounting evidence over the years of the crisis, the question is, are we implicated? That question must drive us as scholars to interrogate the situation, its proximate and root causes, its far-reaching implications. It is our duty as scholars committed to international service, to waging peace. If those words mean what they could mean, we have to ask these questions now. The whole wide world and the future ask this of us. Now, in 2018, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2417, condemning the starving of civilians as a method of warfare and the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to civilian populations. Article 1A, the very first article, delineated the specific assaults and deprivations on food waste that would trigger this global condemnation, and the detail is there, and it's in one of those slides. It seemed, frankly, like a victory. It seemed like a turning point for us. It was a global consensus. And yet 6 years later, as we speak, hunger is being wielded as a weapon of mass destruction. Again, let's turn to the empirics. On October 9th, after the terrible Hamas attack, Israel Defense Minister Gallant announced a complete total siege, direct quote. No electricity, no water, no food, no fuel. We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly. Israeli media then filmed soldiers turning off the water pipes and bombing the entry point crossings into the Strip, keeping in mind the Strip was already dependent on 500 aid trucks every day. So immediately, any food aid expert, anyone who's ever been to Gaza, who's familiar with the blockade, knew that this total siege is a mass death sentence with a terrorizing methodology. The physical and psychological torture of hunger and lethal thirst renders what is euphemistically called a conflict to a grinding, desperate slaughter. Hear the horror of the fact that Gazan families, huddled in rubble, hear their children scream through the night with hunger or watch helplessly as they succumb to death is compounded by the horror that their demise of their children is preventable. But the other horror is that the demise of their children is designed. Israeli officials ordered Gaza's millions to leave their homes, lands, and lives to flee to the southern half of their 25 by 3 mile outdoor prison, even as Israeli forces further bombed all the alleged escape routes, the hospitals, the schools, the city centers, the mosques, the churches, and importantly, all the major production, storage, distribution points for food, the crops, the fields, the orchards, the granaries, the bakeries, the wheat mills, the greenhouses, the poultry farms, the cafeterias, the kitchens, the roads, the UN shelters. The ground invasion pulverized North and then South Gaza, terrorizing safe zones, and hospitals became de facto refugee shelters, feeding stations, and mass morgues. Suddenly, the 2417 condemnation Article 1 had become a to-do list. By December, Gazans made up 80% of the people in the world experiencing famine or catastrophic hunger. The day that the ICJ ruled on the plausibility of South Africa's charge of Israeli genocide in January, that day, Israeli officials alleged that a dozen of the 13,000 United Nations Relief Works Agency staff in Gaza had conspired with Hamas, a very serious allegation. The US severed funding immediately, with over 15 other countries following suit, thereby hamstringing the logistical lifeline of food aid to 5 million Palestinian refugees. In March, however, Reuters reported that UNRWA employees released into Gaza from Israeli detention described being pressured by Israeli authorities into falsely stating their connections to October 7th amidst severe physical beatings, waterboardings, and threats of harm to family members. At this point, all countries but the US have reinstated funding, but the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars and the slander has severely undercut UNRWA's on-the-ground, last-mile food aid distribution, exacerbating famine conditions. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have weaponized food aid itself. And you all probably already know this, that there have been dozens of widely reported instances of Israeli attacks on food aid convoys, delivery points, and aid seekers. And I've got a whole list here, which we don't have time to get into. But the Associated Press reports that in January, Israeli fire struck a crowd of people waiting for aid at a roundabout in Gaza City. January 25th, killing at least 20 and wounding 150. On February 5th, Israeli forces bombed a truck loaded with food aid as it drove toward the distribution in northern Gaza, though it had been cleared by the IDF. The next day, Israeli forces opened fire on the people waiting for that truck. And of course, the notorious flour massacre, when thousands of people in North Gaza gathered to receive urgent flour aid. They had not received aid for over a month in North Gaza, only to be met with a barrage of gunfire. Israeli forces shot and killed 10 starving Palestinians, injured hundreds more, and then, according to CNN and Al Jazeera footage, drove over the fleeing crowds. Over 100 people were crushed to death, 760 wounded. Local witnesses described it as an ambush. Rather than demand accountability by March, the US began airdropping food aid, which aid experts lambast as performative and inefficient, but it's also deadly. In March, when undeployed parachutes plummeted heavy aid pallets, it killed 5 and wounded 10 Gazans below who had traveled in desperation to secure food for their families. In late March, when airdropped pallets fell into the sea accidentally, desperate parents swam into choppy waters to retrieve what they could for their starving children, and 12 drowned. And then, of course, we all know the World Central Kitchen Convoy, which is part of a broader pattern of documented aid workers being struck and killed by Israeli forces, even though each have to have mandatory deconfliction clearance by IDF, which tracks every location in the Strip, every location, with the world's most advanced surveillance technologies. And of course, the US government boasted of a new temporary pier off the Gaza coast to transport food aid in. The $230 million apparatus closed within days due to weather, then reopened, then closed for good, having delivered 1 day's worth of food aid into Gaza Strip. More troublingly, the Israeli operatives who infiltrated the Nusayrat refugee camp in June to release hostages were disguised in food aid trucks coming from that pier, and they launched an attack that killed more than 274 Palestinians, including 64 children, and injured 700 more. That the soldiers were disguised as food aid workers puts the life of every aid worker in danger, as well as the Palestinians desperate for food. Oh heavens, I have so much more to say. Well, we'll open it up for questions at the end, but there's many instances of Israeli officials talking about starving Gazans in a way that proves that there's a deliberate aspect to this, and we need, as the US, to be thinking very closely about this, because on the global stage, we are seen as implicated. And so I call upon my colleagues and the students to keep investigating this as close as possible. And so I'll just end with, there was so much pressure after those fiascos of the spring, international pressure, that Israel did open up more openings in late spring. So there was the projected of a mass death of famine in summer, and then that mitigated to some degree in April and in May. And there was more trade trucks coming in and commercial food, which seemed promising on some level to have some food come in, any food, aid or commercial. But unfortunately, the food prices of that commercial food skyrocketed up to 7,000% of pre-war costs, which is a cruelty for the people who are starving and in shambles economically to see food and not even be able to afford it. Meanwhile, food aid rots in checkpoints, and the Israeli forces wave in commercial convoys full of cigarettes, candy, and sugary energy drinks while blocking the nourishing food for the acutely malnourished children. However, the Rafah ground invasion in late May rescinded that brief respite. So again, in the situation that we're in now, we are worse than we were before the respite began in early spring. Right now, with the Rafah crossing, that left 1,400 aid trucks stranded in northern Sinai hot sun, over 75% of which carried vital food aid supplies, according to the UN. And at this point, and I've got lots of numbers here, which we can go over later, but the food coming in through the Kerem Abu Salam Shalom crossing has plummeted by over 80% from April to September. The World Food Program reports that those receiving some degree of life-saving food assistance, meaning like a can of beans, just the bare minimum, dropped from nearly 1.8 million in May, the high point, to less than 1 million in July, and it has plummeted lower ever since. So at this point, 80% of Gaza is under mandatory evacuation with no place to go. So you have 34,000 traumatized, starving people crammed into each square mile of the so-called safe zone of rubble. At this point, there's very limited screening capacities, but health officials report at least a 300% rise in childhood acute malnutrition, knowing that it's severely much worse on the ground. And we still don't know the number of deaths, but we know that they are rising, and at this point it's up to 40, but they're still not sure because many of the people who have trauma wounds in the hospitals do not survive the trauma wounds, and it's because of malnourishment. So there's a conflation of lots of different comorbidity. How has this ferocious, deliberate famine happened for the eyes of an appalled globe, and yet in this country remains sidelined, minimized, and even justified through racialized discourses of terrorism? Who and what are accountable? When this disaster finally makes the news, it is obfuscated to a general tragic humanitarian crisis, the side effects of a war in a conflict-prone zone, and collateral damage. Those discourses decontextualize the situation, obscure the causes, deploy racialized tropes of violence, absolve US guilt, and undermine authentic paths toward healing and peace. Academia has a crux role to play in deeper analysis. And one doesn't need to go too deep because the blatant statements of racism and genocidal statements are very obvious, which I've got many for. I think I'm out of time. There's so much more, but I think I'll just end with the violence of the erasure of Palestine, both literally but even discursively, and a proof of that is the US Congress, where a recent bill proposed to require Palestinian agricultural products to be labeled as made in Israel. So the violence of the erasure of Palestine through its food depends on systemic dehumanization, which itself depends on the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Palestinian racism driving that dehumanization. We are fortunate at AU to have very brilliant scholars who are researching this. Professor Mariam Durrani, Irene Kallis, and Maha Hilal, and others are thinking through how racism works into the systemic dehumanization, the structures of dehumanization that Mohammed was just talking about, that justify the horrors that we're seeing and that we're involved in. And yet, I'll end with, against monumental odds, the surviving Palestinian farmers, fishers, pastoralists, bakers, gardeners, urban growers, chefs, and other food providers, the ones that have survived, the ones that are alive, continue through their multi-generational struggle for physical and cultural survival. Gazan foodways have been targeted and attacked, so many of them have been destroyed, but some persist with renown and legendary resourcefulness. I've been working with Leila El-Haddad, a Gazan food writer, as she chronicles her own family and community in Gaza, how even in the toxic rubble, stunningly, people are scrounging enough food to share among each other, break fast together for Ramadan, and even plant gardens in the rubble. Nevertheless, as a generation of Palestinian children face a lethal mix of dehydration, diarrhea, and wasting, thousands of them maimed in the nightmare category of wounded, minor, no surviving family, it is crucial to stay vigilant here in DC, in universities, and not succumb to silence, to keep interrogating what are the obstacles to a ceasefire, what are the obstacles to a military disarmament, to the Palestinian right to exist, even to the vast emergency food and medical aid openings, even if they come too late. And so concurrently, Palestine must be able to recover food, water, and land sovereignty for its own survival and freedom, as well as for the foundation for any authentic peace in the region and beyond. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Anthony Wanis-St. John. Thank you to my fellow panelists for bearing witness and bringing your analysis and reflections and research to bear. I study negotiations and armed conflicts and how they end. It occurred to me as I was preparing for this presentation that sometimes armed conflicts are several kinds of armed conflicts mixed together. But we know how wars end. There are several different ways. Genocides end when the killing is done or when some subgroup of the international community puts an end to it, typically by armed intervention. Here we have both happening at the same time. There is a kind of armed conflict, although it is extraordinarily asymmetric between Hamas and Israel. And there is a slow but extraordinarily escalated and accelerated genocidal violence against the population. And those things kind of have to be looked at separately and together at the same time. Conflict gets stopped or paused and I use pause quite deliberately here, for a number of reasons. The first might be the exhaustion of the fighting parties. They don't have the forces, they don't have the reinforcements, they cannot supply their fighting forces. That's one. Second, when the leaders of the conflict parties decide that their war aims have been achieved or are as close to achievable as they think they can. Third is when the political will of the leaders involved shift towards a ceasefire because the war aims themselves may be seen as unachievable and they start looking for a non-combat way to achieve the political aims that they had. And the fourth is political pressure from typically other states or their own civil societies, and sometimes some sort of hybrid fusion of the two. 3 and 4 of these, numbers 3 and 4 of the 4 that I just described are the ones that are most currently relevant. But number 3, the political will shifting, seems incredibly elusive right now, given the state of fragmented decision-making on the Israeli side. And number 4, pressure by other states has been stunningly ineffective, given the kind of diplomatic gravitas that Qatar, Egypt, and the United States could have brought to bear, but have not to date. And I'll talk a little bit more about those things. I have spent some time in the last decade looking particularly at ceasefire negotiations as a separate thing from comprehensive peace negotiations. They are related, but they are very, very, very different from each other. What we have been seeing for the last year is the pursuit, the constant daily reporting of what I call these stunningly ineffective ceasefire negotiations. When they are successful, they are remarkably fragile and fraught. Leaders in the conflict resist them. The fighting forces fragment at times and claim that they're not covered by the ceasefire and want to continue the fight. The decision-making apparatus on each side gets challenged, as some people prefer the combat to continue while others want to pursue a more political path. If a ceasefire is achieved, it's achieved only with the input of the highest level decision makers. But it can be broken by the lowest level of combatants. So they are quite easily broken and frequently are broken. We have had a number of ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and the Israelis in the last decade and a half or so since the Second Intifada. Every one of them, of course, as we know, has been the prelude to the next chapter of fighting. And that's partly because the ceasefire negotiations themselves never were followed up by getting back on track to the comprehensive peace, which is a more difficult and more time-consuming and more politically costly, but ultimately much more important thing to do. They're different. They take a different kind of resource, and what we've seen, especially on the Israeli side in the last decade and a half, is that there has been a consistent erosion of any desire or pursuit policy-wise of what had been the peace process. Once Benjamin Netanyahu attained power, and he only lost it for a little while and then has been in it since then, he has been on a very self-declared path of destroying the peace process, and he has succeeded in ways that I don't think he could have possibly dreamed of. The Qatar, Egypt, and US mediation, as I've said, has achieved practically nothing. No substantive alteration in the combat plans of the IDF, no real shift in the strategy or the tactics of Hamas that we know of, and a constant piling on of new conditions by each party as they get upset with the other party's own counter conditions. So this is where we are now on the so-called, attempts to wage peace. And there are both sad precedents to this, as well as some hopeful ones. I want to highlight both. Humanitarian pauses or attempts to get a ceasefire have been pursued and yet been in danger since the founding of the State of Israel. Ralph Bunche and Count Bernadotte, early UN mediators, in their attempts to secure the return of refugees displaced by the fighting in the late 40s, were essentially trying to pursue the humanitarian pauses rather than the comprehensive peace. And those things were, of course, remarkably unsuccessful, and that set the stage for a long history of occasionally having some breakthroughs, but always leaving people disappointed with the return to the comprehensive peace track. We have seen an incredible inability, or perhaps reluctance on the part of the Israeli governments to engage in any kind of entertainment of a direct dialogue with Hamas, which should have been one of their principal political aims. If they had seen that they could not achieve a military victory over Hamas, because it is a resistance movement and not a foreign-funded fighting force in its entirety, then some sort of political dialogue should have been part of the tactical or strategic aims. But since they had abandoned that track with the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, they probably thought, what's the purpose of doing so with Hamas? So that's all the negative side. There have been some positives in history, and the early Israeli PLO contacts in the 80s that were direct started as a result of the PLO-Israel fighting that was taking place then, or that had previously taken place inside of Lebanon, when Lebanon was the battleground between the PLO and the Israelis. And some Israeli decision makers were interested in contact with the then proscribed PLO and thought that they might use those as the basis to do things like POW MIA recovery, but also then use those talks as a way to sort of tentatively feel out, can we get to a comprehensive peace track? So that's how things should start. There should be some tentative pressure from the international community for the parties to talk directly rather than through intermediaries who haven't done a whole hell of a lot of anything in the last year. And then get them not only to pursue a cessation of violence now, which is important because it saves lives, but to get back on the comprehensive peace track. And thank you very much. I'll be happy to talk about more of this in the Q&A.
So we welcome your questions. There is a mic over there and a mic over there. So if you wouldn't mind sort of just standing in line and then just speaking your question on the mic, I think that will be easiest given the size of the room. So technically, we have the room until 5:30, and so we will probably go until then. But if you feel the need to leave at 5, which is an hour and a half after the event started, please feel free to do so. And yes, we'll take 3 questions at a time. I see one there, so please, as they're asking their question, please feel free to come on up on the other side. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation and your passion. I think it was really interesting to hear about the different ways that basic services can be used to harm regular citizens. I think from my perspective, the one aspect that I missed in all of this is the responsibility of Hamas and separating Hamas from the Gazan people. There's a very unfortunate situation happening in Gaza where there was a free and fair election that was held to nominate Hamas to be the power structure in Gaza. And since that time, there have been no further elections. So my question is, while all of your comments have been fantastic, and I wrote down a lot of them, like Palestinians should not be subhuman. We should focus on human dignity and humanity. Victimhood is not different between Jews and Palestinians. So true. Everybody should have access to free, to food and to water and all of those things. But a major part of the conversation that I didn't hear is that Hamas is actually preventing access and using their own citizens as a shield. And, well, there are many different perspectives, right? So I just think looking at it comprehensively is important. It is a complex regional issue, and I think that is one important element that has been left out of this academic discussion. So I would love to hear your comments and feedback on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. We'll take two more, please. Whoever was.
Who wants to go first? I can go first.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate all your knowledge and all what you bring. I actually, from February to June of this year, was volunteering in the West Bank, working with shepherds, and I saw a lot of this sort of what I would describe as ecological terrorism. I know terrorism is a sensitive word, but I don't like to even call them settlers. I like to call them terrorists, and that's the opinion of a lot of people I know there. A lot of things such as, obviously what's happening on Gaza is at a horrific scale, but even in the West Bank, I saw, water access be blocked, or people in, I'm in contact with Auda Hathalin, who is one of the leaders of Masafer Yatta, particularly the village of El Khair, and the terrorists regularly cut off their water supply. And, with the Flower Massacre, I remember being at a protest organized by a group of left-wing Israeli activists, left-wing Jewish Israeli activists, and we brought bags of flour with red handprints on them to represent, and the police got especially violent. But I have so many stories, but one of the things that I deeply worry is the possibility of Gaza potentially becoming completely inhabitable for the next, 20 or so, maybe even longer years. Because, think about what the U.S. has done in both Vietnam and a lot of Southeast Asia with their use of Agent Orange and other chemical warfare, to a point where people generations after the Vietnam War ended are being born with severe birth defects and being born with severe medical conditions. Even in Japan, what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people still have not just trauma, but there's long-term medical issues as an effect of the nuclear radiation decades later. And I don't know if you're of the scientific, have the scientific knowledge to determine, but personally, I was wondering, one, what you just thought of this in general, and two, if it even is possible for, people talk, these settlers talk about settling Gaza. I don't know if Gaza is going to be even livable, just because of the amount of horrific chemical damage that has been committed by, the constant bombings and, the dumping of medical waste. It really is truly horrific. And I'm sorry, I'm getting really emotional because I just worry I knew people there. And I just hope it, I hope your guys are more optimistic in that it can be safe for the people there again. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. No, if there's a button.
Push it up towards you.
Okay, thank you. Hi. So first, thank you for this particular dialogue, I would call it. My name is Claudia Barragan. I am an American University alumni. Specifically, I identify as Indigenous Aymara. I wanted to bring my question and my comments down to the community level, because I feel like it's been 5 years for me since I set foot on campus, because personally, I have not, one, felt comfortable coming back because of my identity, one. Two, because of just the general feel of what the university has stood for a very long time and continues to stand for. So for me, coming into this community is really important. It's a community that I participated in, I funded with my money. I'm an SIS alumni. I also practice equitable development, and I'm an equitable development practitioner from grassroots, from that perspective. My question, well, a couple of things, especially due to the first question that came up, right? That's why I want to, if for whatever reason I can be given this access, let's bring it on to today. Let's bring it on, well, not just today, but let's bring it on to this community, right? How this impacts us as well. That's really important. And us is everyone, right? Specifically people who have been directly impacted. So because I'm Indigenous, I don't look at things in a linear history timeline. And most of the presentation has been since October 7th, right? So much have we've seen since October 7th. I missed a little bit of the earlier part of the presentation, but it would be great for you to speak and to have more of this opportunities discussing what happened before October 7th in the ecologies. Ecologies of violence, of displacement, what has been going on before October 7th in terms of wash, in terms of food, in terms of eco-colonialism, even development, right? We're thinking about saving something that others question about, saving Gaza and what it will be right now. But like development is not even a question there anymore, right, at this point. So I would like if you could touch on that, because while I was here in 2015, no one was talking about this. And that was happening over there. And when I say this, is AU. So thank you for this, and I support it.
So I know we have a lot of questions, so I would ask that you keep your question or comment brief so that everyone can get a chance to ask. So what we'll do now is we'll very briefly respond. I'll turn it over to Mohammed, please, to respond first.
Thank you. I'll respond to the Hamas question. I would like to invite the person who asked to consider the following things. One, the issue of responsibility of Hamas. To entirely blame Hamas as a terrorist organization and put the blame on Hamas for the genocide is really something that I've been hearing a lot. And that's something that we need to reconsider, because Hamas won the election in 2006. And Hamas could not exercise its political, and I disagree with Hamas's ideology in general, but for fair, they won election and they could not exercise those elections, and immediately they were put in a prison that lasted until 2024, and they did not have any means to exit or to exercise their power in like any part because of Fatah and Hamas dispute. How come Fatah and Hamas dispute continued from 2006 to 2023? You should read a little bit about how Israel prevented many of the reconciliation and undermined any attempt for a genuine reconciliation between them, including the millions of dollars that they supplied through the Qatari connection between 2015 until 2018, with the Israeli security service facilitating the funds to go into Gaza. Israeli security and Netanyahu himself acknowledged recently after October 7 that Israel policy has been to keep the divide between Hamas and Fatah in order to weaken the Palestinian Authority as well as keep Hamas as well weak. Second point that you might disagree with, but I invite you to consider. Hamas is not very different from the Israeli right-wing government in terms of ideology today. If you want to delegitimize Hamas and split it from the 60% Palestinian who voted for it and as a result won the election, you really need to think, how can we describe the settlers, the Israeli government, the state-sponsored violence and terrorism as also illegitimate, and not fall into the trap that blaming everything on Hamas and blaming Hamas for the genocide that Israel has committed. That it doesn't mean Hamas did not commit mistakes in the between 2006 and 2020 or 23. We have to think about that and consider it, obviously. But again, not to use this as an excuse. The Israeli right-wing government, with its charter, with its ideology, does not give basic right to the Palestinian to exist. Hamas, on the other hand, changed its charter in 2017 and de facto accepted two-state solution and called it Hudna. Anyone who knows what the meaning of Hudna, Hamas have done that. So please, let's also reflect on these aspects and not necessarily fall into that trap that you blame the people who being genocide for not acting according to what you like to do.
Can I speak to the habitability?
Yeah, go ahead.
Help me, Anthony.
Same Anthony, they're gonna kill the flies and the microphone.
I have people for that. Very quickly, the university is many things. We're the university, right? And we need to be the university. On the point about Hamas, I condemn what Hamas did on October 7th unequivocally. Those are war crimes. It's quite clear. You don't have to be, the two things can be true at the same time. And, the water dynamics that I was describing had decades of roots before Hamas even came into existence. And so we're it's a complicated story. There's a lot of pieces to the story, but we've got to see that story as an arc of history. I think that's really important. But what I really wanted to speak to was the very passionate question, an appropriate question, about the habitability of Gaza. And we are right to be worried about that. People will pay the consequences of this for generations. They will pay it in their own health. They will pay it in the health of their descendants. If there's a hopeful thought here, it is that the United Nations Environment Program, the Post-Conflict and Disaster Management Branch, which is a group I have worked with for many years, perhaps sadly because of the supply of cases that we have, has developed quite a bit of experience with doing rapid environmental appraisals in the context of war-torn societies, of using those environmental assessments as a way to mobilize cleanup, as a way to build out national capacities, which will be very important for the future of Palestine in the process of doing that. And so, there is a set of resources and approach that can be mobilized here if the political space to do so can be created. And I hold on to that as at least a partially hopeful aspect of your very important question.
And to the very powerful set of questions for the final questioner, we didn't even get to the rich history. There's not even enough time. But I just wanted to pull out the kafia to show that there's three. This is a textile, and it's a textile of food sovereignty. There's a whole text, in this. And it's based around connection to water. This is a fishing net. So the ancient tradition of Gazan fishing in the Mediterranean Sea and how that has been targeted by Israeli forces and reduced to a 3 nautical mile strip of the sea that is totally overfished, and at this point the fishing industry is largely collapsed into rubble. And then, of course, the olive leaves, which Malini talked about, but some of these olive trees are 4,000 years old. There's thousands of years of history of olive culture. It's very spiritual, it's very nutritional, there's a whole connection to land. And then the road and the path, which is the third symbol of the kafia. And the road and the symbol symbolize in the Musha indigenous land tenure system, communal land tenure system of Palestine, which has a 4,000-year-old history. Noor Masalha has written a great book on it. There's rotational grazing, pastoralist grazing. There's the harvests are done in a circular formation where the olives are harvested, the pomegranates, the figs, all of the different fruits and nuts. And then also there's paths of wild food foraging. So the movement is part of the landscape, and the mobility of moving around the landscape is a very ancient tradition that I've been honored to learn from people who are trying to upkeep it and keep it going. And of course, the apartheid is a constraint on mobility, the cutting down of 1 million olive trees since 1967, and the assault on the Gazan fishermen is both, the kafia is a testament to the indigenous agricultural and food and seafood systems, but also the many ways that it's being targeted.
And just quickly to respond to Claudia's point about not feeling welcome back at the AU community, but finally actually coming onto campus for this event. We are extraordinarily grateful that you came here. This will not be the last event that calls out and calls attention to the silencing of everything we've just talked about and everything we've just talked about, right? And so we want to make it clear to you all that we hear you. You know, we are not the minority here, and that we want to engage in these conversations going forward, because ultimately I think we are all invested in liberation, right? That is ultimately what we're here for. And try as they might, the university administration, will try and put into place rules to sort of control, suppress. But I think there are also ways in which we can enter into dialogue, and we must continue to do that. And alum like you are very vital to this. Three new questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I think over the past year, you could easily argue that this situation in Israel-Palestine is the most hopeless that it's ever been in history. So I'm wondering, what are some of the things that give you hope? Because I feel like so many aspects of this conflict have fundamentally changed since 1948. I mean, if 50 years ago, if you had told people that one day most Arab governments would recognize the state of Israel and Israel would view Iran as its primary enemy, that would have seemed crazy, because at that time, Iran was an ally to Israel and they viewed Egypt as their biggest enemy by far. But throughout the decades, the one constant has remained the suffering of the Palestinian people. That has never changed. But nevertheless, I see a few recent developments that give me small amounts of hope, whether it's the protests within Israel against Netanyahu and about the hostage situation, or just the unprecedented levels of global sympathy for the plight of the Palestinian people. I'm wondering if any of you could speak to that.
Thank you again for a great panel. I'll keep it quick. My question is about the eco-genocide that's been going on since even before the first Nakba and before the establishment of the Israeli state, with the settlers coming in and delegitimizing millions of years, or a long history of Palestinian existence. And just in general, when a global world order, when some existences are seen as more legitimate as others, how do we address, even if there is a comprehensive peace agreement, is there any place in that to address this eco-genocide that's been going on for decades now, and the question of reparations for those that have already lost their lives, not just from the war and direct violence, but this indirect violence that we've learned so much about today. So yeah, those are some of my questions.
Thank you. Can you read this out aloud while she signs? My name is Rachel from the International Development Program. Anthony, since you discussed the peace process and explained the role of leaders and how it has been ineffective in this conflict, what is the next step for the ceasefire to be effective?
Is that three?
Yeah.
Shall we go?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll take a little shot at hope as well. I haven't been... the high point of hope for me was when the peace process got really going. And 5 years down the line, when it looked like there was going to be not just mutual recognition, but a comprehensive peace, at least a track of talks, and it got started, and then of course it frittered out and never really got serious again. There was a last-ditch attempt in the last days of the Clinton administration, but hope has been difficult to find since then. What gives me hope, to answer your question properly, is the US protest movements, the student protest movements. As a student myself, as an undergrad, it was the South Africa apartheid days, it was US involvement in Central America. Our kids make fun of us, but yes, we made a difference and we changed Congress's mind, and Congress put pressure on the Reagan administration, and things were done that changed American policy. And that was an important thing. That was the voice of civil society changing its tenor, its timbre, its tone, and expressing itself as anti-hegemonic, anti-colonial, and anti-aggression. And the rest of the United States institutions sort of followed along and said, okay, this is a good change. It was a great moment. And it took the groundswell from the bottom. And so the American student protests really brought me a lot of hope. Leaders and the next step in the ceasefire. Well, I have hinted at what I think the next step is, right? It's a far more vigorous and assertive mediation effort. The United States has at its disposal a number of levers of influence with the Israeli government, and principally it's the weapons transfer. All of our security assistance to other countries is predicated on compliance with our laws with regard to human rights by the receiving forces are occasionally upheld. With the Israelis, they seem to be ignored. We have had occasional talk in the last year about Leahy laws. Those are our human rights conditionalities on security assistance, being raised for particular units and commanders in the IDF. That's not enough. The next step would really be to say, we are freezing all military assistance to Israel, period, now, and not going to renew it until the political situation changes. Thank you for the snapping. Over.
Can I comment? Just thank you. The hope question is the most difficult out of those. And I'm in the business of giving hope to people as a peacemaker for the many years. And I thank you for answering yourself also, because I think those are the two things many of us seeing in it hope. One is the solidarity movement, of course, globally. It does give hope. The second one for me is that southern states, southern hemisphere states, and many also other states have taken clear stand, whether it's in Latin America or Europe or Africa or the South Asia as well. That is a new spirit. The Palestinian liberation issue is in different stand today. American Jewish voices in the US, although very few, but there are voices, and those give me hope that it's impossible to generalize that the whole community is standing with the campaign of genocide. There are voices and need to be reckoned with, and I think cooperated with and work with. There is a crack in the pro-Israel lobby capacity to influence the public and even policymakers. The 29 of October panel we're gonna have will be testimony of that in terms of voices of dissent. My son is with his grandfathers for the past 10 days. I was supposed to be with them. What gives me hope is my father telling my son that when he asked him what's going to happen to us, he said, and I think that's true, my father is 82 years old. He said he lived the Nakba. He was 6 years old during the first Nakba. And he said, it's okay, this time it's different because none of us is going to leave. So the resiliency of the Palestinian where they are today, that it is a Nakba and it is a genocide, but the response has been significantly different on the community level, on the people level, in terms of standing their grounds and connecting to the land. And I think that's something important to keep in as part of keeping our humanity and the human dignity. That is essential, and I think that's something at least give me hope. But to be honest with you, at the end of every night since October, I ask the same question, and I've been asked every time, and the answer is difficult, but I don't think we have any other choice but to look for hopeful and to believe that this darkness is not going to continue, and that's where the inner hope can be generated. And there are many allies around us, Native American, African American, Latino. It's across, I think the perfect quote you gave from the president of Colombia. it's like a Black Lives Matters. We all felt supported and connected to it in different way. And I think the Palestinian issue and what they're suffering is not different than that. I do have one fear, and I'll stop here, that the depopulation of Gaza and make it inhabitable, and then ceasefire, and after the ceasefire, the American, the European, and the Australian will open the border for migration, easy migration for Palestinian, and because it's inhabitable, then the Smotrich-Ben Gviri plan, as it has been described, that's where the exodus might take place between year 1 and year 4 after the ceasefire stop. And for that, I'm on 2-3 different groups who are trying to work towards the day after in terms of keeping people and supporting them on the ground. So this is not over even if there is ceasefire. That's where the dealing with the destruction on the ground is really where people need help and support and aid. Thank you.
So I think that the question of reparations is always a deeply philosophical one, but it's also quite pragmatic. I mean, we know that Germany paid reparations for the Holocaust, right? The most heinous crime. And in fact, that money was used to help build Israel, right? So we know that reparations do happen. In the case of the United States, it's been a long-standing conversations, reparations for slavery, reparations for Jim Crow, reparations for ongoing violence and the transfer of wealth across generational lines, right? So I think that it's an important question to constantly foreground because it has happened and it could happen. And so at least even for the philosophical conversation, right, the reparations for colonialism, reparations for climate change, I think we have to keep it alive. So let's take a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, just want to say thank you to the speakers for being here. I think I can speak for everyone when I say it was very emotional and profound discussion. It's good to hear it from people who are very knowledgeable about it. So my question kind of builds on, again, on the long-term effects of the genocide going on and somewhat on the internalization and mental aspects of things. So I know earlier someone mentioned the vocabulary of slow genocide was utilized to discuss the state that Palestinians are currently living in. And in a lot of past genocidal regimes, it's been clear that the state that's enforcing this genocide takes part in education and indoctrination processes to enforce this type of ideology. I was wondering how you could discuss how this takes place, especially when it comes to youth. How has this process been weaponized, and how we see these ideologies play out over generations? And in contrast, when it comes to Palestine right now, could you kind of build on the generational trauma and kind of those aspects looking forward into the future?
Hi, my name is Michael Brenner. I'm a history professor here and I'll also direct the Center for Israel Studies. And I feel a little bit like in the lion's den, but I think it's very important to hear other opinions. And I often hear from Israelis, and I often hear from Jewish audiences about their fears in Israel being attacked by Hezbollah, by Hamas, by their existential fears. And I wish some of them would be here and would also hear your side. But I also wish you would hear the other side and actually include the other side, the fears of Jews in the region. There are about 7.5 million Jewish Israelis and about the same number of Palestinians. And they all have fears. And Malini, you mentioned the Holocaust. Both on my parents' side, almost the whole families were killed in the Holocaust. And that was the reason they wanted to build a state of Israel, that this would never happen again. And I feel this is very important, what you all said, but there was also something missing, the fear of the other side. And where was the lump in your throat on October 7th? And where was the big crowds on campus when 1,200 people were murdered brutally? And I don't want to say these are more victims and these are less victims. But when we talk about dialogue, try to have a panel where you also have somebody who explains maybe why there are fears on the other side. I despise the Israeli government. I think people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are horrible. I despise Hamas for their terrorist acts and Hezbollah. But can we come together on the campus, build bridges, and hear the fears on both sides on one panel? I always are on the other side and hear the other people, and they don't hear you guys. And I want us to come together. And I don't want to take anything away from the horrible suffering of the Palestinian people. But there is also some reason why Jews in Israel fear. And if you read the original Hamas Carta, talking about anti-Semitism, that's not just anti-Israel, that's pure anti-Semitism. So we have to talk about this too. And I hope we can come together. It's not a football game, or I'm from Germany, a soccer game, where here are the people with the Palestinian flags and here are the people with the Israel flags. We have to find a way to come together. And I know, Ken, you were... Well, we can discuss that.
I suggest, excuse me.
Of course, I said that.
Just you let him
I
finish
said that.
his
I said that. And I'm done. But maybe we can start talking to each other and not shouting at each other.
Thank you.
We have a right to say that.
Can I, are we still taking questions?
That was the second one, so
Okay.
let's take a third one, please.
There was three, but
Oh, was that three?
I couldn't keep
Okay.
track of 7 and 9. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say as well, just echoing a lot of the earlier sentiments prior to the latest speaker, to thank you for the work that you do and for your commitment to it and for sharing your knowledge here with us, especially because a lot of the people in the audience are a lot younger or don't know as much as you have dedicated your lives to. So I appreciate that and I want to recognize that. And I also wanted to pull on a thread that was briefly mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is the inapplicability of the law, particularly international law, in addressing just the extent of the violence of eco-terrorism and the genocide occurring now by the Israeli government. If anything, to me at least, it seems that international law has continuously failed to address the urgency of the matter, and in fact it's obfuscated it, often delayed it, particularly when we even use the phrase ceasefire now, underscoring the now, that too has also been put on pause, right? And so I am curious how we continue to resist, continue to organize, continue to strategize against the ongoing colonialism in the area and in the region, particularly in the settler colonialism and terrorism of the Israeli government and Israeli nation state under this sort of apparatus of international law that continues to fail colonized people, because ultimately it is funded to kind of how can I say, cushion empire and cushion the imperialism that surrounds and continues. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, because I think it was only mentioned briefly, but I think it's important that we talk about how law, particularly international law, continues to fail us because it only serves to maintain the status quo and maintain empire in power. And so I think it's important to talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. So Michael, thank you for coming and thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your point of view. And as you know, and we're about to say, I have worked for a long time with many Israeli peace organizations on trying to bring people together about environmental sanity in a region that is getting smacked by climate change and a host of other challenges. And frankly, one of the things I had written down in my list of the things that gave me hope that I didn't want to be redundant, I wrote down several things. One of them was, I know too many Israelis who want peace and who want to live side by side in dignity with Palestinians. They are not in the majority in Israel. They're not close to in the majority of them in Israel, but they exist and they're a key part of this conversation. That said, I also have quite a bit of sympathy for the intervention that was made. And let me just say, if you're going to intervene, go to the mic because we're recording. We've got people online. We have some people with hearing challenges and so on. So let's get this all done sequentially and on the microphones. I have some sympathy for what was said on the other side of the room. I don't think structuring a panel like this as a debate would do much beyond just, hurling invective back and forth. There's certain kinds of settings where debate is appropriate. There's other kinds of settings where dialogue is appropriate. And there's still other kinds of settings where exploring a concept and an idea that food and water and the historical arc of development around them is a lens through which we can see what is happening is also important. We've been having this conversation in our offices for years. We're sharing it now with you, and I think that's entirely appropriate. And I'll end by saying all you have to do is walk out the lobby there and see the poster display that is a paean to the glory of pro-democratic U.S. foreign policy to see that there are many points of view being exchanged around the university, and this point of view is in no way dominant or hegemonic or foreclosing the expression of other points of view. I would love to see the Center for Israel Studies sponsor a dialogue, not a debate, because I don't think that's the right format in this inflamed moment. Yes, well, I would love to see something like that happen if it were structured in a proper and equitable and respectable way. It'd be a good thing for this campus.
Thank you. Nicely done. So we'll try to continue in the same line. So thank you, Michael, for raising this question. It's important. And I have written my dissertation 40 years ago about dialogue that even funded and run by many American Jewish organizations and run also by some Israeli foreign ministry part. And I teach dialogue for the past 30 years in this place as well. And I think dialogue is something like the sweet pie that no one can reject. However, I am a victim of this dialogue. That's why I started my talk today. I said very clearly, I'm speaking today from non-violence resistance perspective. We are in the middle of a genocide. Yeah. In the middle of a genocide, to sit with some person who does not recognize ceasefire, does not recognize what's going on the ground, and still would like to equalize and paint the situation as symmetry between the two different sides, I will not be honest. I will not be honest to my profession, to my intellectual work that I've spent 40 years in it, if I engage with that without caution and without necessarily well preparation to do. So dialogue, yes, ala rasi, as we said in Arabic, but again, let's not manipulate and abuse the term of dialogue as a way to silence the discourse that also exists on the ground. Now, I'm also a product of the Israeli narrative, certain Israeli narrative that you describe, that takes the Holocaust and try to delegitimize the right of Palestinians to exist on this. As a Holocaust survivor that I mentioned earlier, who took a totally different decision, totally different path. And they said, as a Holocaust survivor of Holocaust, I do recognize the right of indigenous people who were in 1940 and 30 there. And that's their starting point. That acknowledgement is a base for somebody who want to claim the moral beacon of victimhood of the Holocaust. And I think that's where the starting point of the conversation during these days. What is needed is an element of solidarity. The 1,200 who were killed, and every one of us on the panel have recognized that. No. Well, at least I did, and Anthony did as well, and also Malini did. So let's and also, but regardless, you see, that's the issue of the selective, excuse me, that's the issue of the selective hearing we all suffer from. So what we want to do is really be able to be critical of our own side and be able to not use dialogue as an element of silence. On this campus, and I'll stop here, on this campus, since October 7, we had one event last semester that I've organized with Solidarity. Beside that, it was impossible to speak up publicly. Student faculty complained that they've been terrified and terrorized by certain responses when they spoke about this discourse. So in our work since October 7 in this community, we want to create this space to be safe for this discourse and not feel guilty that we are not moving with the classic dialogical symmetric format. That has a space and that has a time, and it should be done, but should be done under certain condition and under certain circumstances. So I do invite you, Michael, to express your solidarity and to break the silence regarding the genocide as a base for us to talk.
We have reached 5:30, but maybe we'll take this last three batch.
Yeah, last three questions.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't get your last name. Professor Michael Brenner. Okay. I think what you mentioned, it shouldn't be dismissed. I think fear can be passed down intergenerationally. I think fear can be weaponized, and I think fear, it can blind you, and I think operating from a point of fear is something that we all need to move beyond. It doesn't just show up in the conflict of Israel and Palestine. It shows up in the conflict of settlerism here in the United States. It shows up everywhere. And I think something that a lot of my Jewish friends have done a really great job is leading the cause on healing, because I think something that happens to you generations ago can still be passed down from your grandparents to your parents to you. And I think that automatically will change how you see this issue. And so I think this is part statement, part question, but how can Jewish people, how can Americans, because we are also complicit in this, deal with fear and lack of security and trauma, thank you, trauma is what I'm looking for, and move forward, because it doesn't matter if we have a ceasefire, it doesn't matter if Israel just is wiped off the face of the earth. Obviously that matters, but if you don't address fear, these issues keep happening. If you don't address trauma and lack of security, it keeps coming up. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. Can we take two last questions or comments?
I'll try to be quick. My first question is, the U.S. has been working on the ceasefire for months, and it seems like it's not really going anywhere, especially now with the conflict escalating in Lebanon. They're probably going to be linked, so it's only going to be harder. I've heard many times that the U.S.-Saudi mega deal joined with, Israel-Saudi normalizations could be used as a way to pave the way to a ceasefire, according to some even for Palestinian statehood. Saudi, I think, even said that there's not going to be normalization with Israel or like any deal unless the Palestinian issue is included in it. I was wondering, if this is actually something that is realistic. And then my other point is, I know that recently former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert and Al-Kidwa have been working together, and they put out a statement that had both like a comprehensive long-term peace plan that was basically Olmert's peace plan in 2008, and also a short-term plan for a ceasefire that would be, immediately ending the war, followed by the release of all the hostages in Gaza and the agreed number of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli prisons, then withdrawal of Israeli forces, deployment of a temporary Arab and Palestinian security presence, and like a lot more details. I mean, this kind of gave me a little bit of hope that, you know, people from both sides are, you know, talking about it, discussing it, but none of them are in power, so it's not like they can do anything. So I wonder, besides the whole like short-term ceasefire negotiations, how it's going to be possible to rebuild, you know, the basis for the peace process once there is a ceasefire. You know, if just a change of leadership is going to be enough, or, you know, like the people on both sides are probably very, they're grieving in their own way, so I don't think they're going to want to sit down and, you know, talk about peace. So what is something that could be done, I guess? Thank you.
Enough, final. It's a comment. Okay. I'm Elise. I'm the person, or one of the two people who interjected. And I know that there were some people over here who were like upset that I did that. And I appreciated the call to like come to the mic because there are people virtually. So I'm going to say what I said before and add some things now. The main reason I interjected is because this idea that dialogue somehow sits outside of the violent context in which we exist is itself a colonial lie. And even giving energy and time to these violent discourses is itself replicating the colonial construct that is creating the genocide in Gaza, the genocide in Palestine more broadly, and the war or aggressions in Lebanon. And so to pretend like this has to be this docile space is itself a white construct. And I just reject the idea that we have to sit and listen to things that are explicitly lies or being misconstrued. So what exactly is being misconstrued? The first is that we're talking about an equal discursive context. We are not. Because it's not just what happens on this campus. It's not equal bodies. We're talking about people who have the financial, discursive, diplomatic support of the state. So when we're talking about who these two-year language Jewish students are, which I also reject because there are plenty of anti-Zionist Jewish people, such as Jewish Voices for Peace, who have explicitly been against the Israeli Studies Department and the Zionist project more broadly, who have been in solidarity with the Palestinian people for decades. So, and to that extent, the people who are on the side of Palestine have been doxxed by the Khmer mission. They've been put on FBI watch lists. At Columbia, IOF students used chemical warfare on protesters. We have seen the complete shutdown of any kind of dialogue and protest on this campus, and it's not because of what's happening in Israeli studies, it's because of what's happening for Palestinians. And so even the idea that we have to have this both sides debate, like, that is just such crap. Sorry, excuse my language, not really. The other thing too is this idea of like when you're gonna bring people to the table, like when you are the colonizer, when you have the power, you get to dictate who gets to come to the table. And when you agree to a seat at the table, you're already conceding that someone else has the right to make those rules in the first place. And so when we have a situation like this, where by a miracle, we have a Palestinian context where like we're actually hearing about the violences that have happened, not just for the last year, but for the last several, like 100 years, to then be said that there is something that we're doing wrong for not inviting people who are not committed to Palestinian life to the table is so discursively violent, and I just think should not be tolerated. Yeah, that is what I have to say for now. So.
Maybe we'll just say final few thoughts, and I know there was so much just pitched, really brilliant thoughts far and everywhere. So, oh well.
So yeah, I mean we're at time. Do you want to add something else, Ken? Okay.
I'll say one or two things. A nice clean ceasefire would be very simple. Forces stop fighting and they go back to where they were before the fighting started. This is not that kind of conflict, and so it's not going to be that kind of ceasefire. People want some compensation. The Israelis have taken a lot of Palestinians into custody. They've judged and put them into. They've taken people that they don't want to let go, right? And there are still Israeli hostages. So I think both sides are adding conditions as they go, and meanwhile people die for all the reasons that we discussed here on this panel, as well as direct armed conflict. So I think the conditions that keep getting added to ceasefires are both understandable, but they also prolong the fighting. If it were up to me, and it is not, I would go for the most simple kind of ceasefire first, but make it explicitly tied to very, very, very aggressive talks on all the outstanding things that need to be done. I think what we're seeing now is a kind of middle ground where there, the three-phase thing with possible Saudi involvement. It is not quite comprehensive peace, but it's some sort of lure to see if we could get the Israelis to play ball. And I think they should just play ball without the promise of anything from Saudi Arabia myself. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'll say one quick thing as my final comment, and that is this space is so valuable, and I really cherish that you all came and brought these questions and these comments, and how much thought and care are put into them, and how much bravery and how much inquiry. I feel like this is the best of the university space, is to hold these truths and these impossible questions, and to grapple with the questions that haven't even been asked, over the past year. So I think I'll just end with my hope, and what gives me hope is that the whole wide world, there is a shocking consensus around solidarity with Gaza and Palestine. And actually, most heads of state don't agree with the people who are in those countries. So to have, when you have these huge votes at the UN General Assembly where there's a near unanimous majority people supporting Palestinian statehood, those are heads of state and the people on the ground in the streets. So this incredible majority. We're in the bubble in the US. We're the ones who are isolating ourselves with the ignorance of what's going on and the misguided understanding. And to get back to the points being made, it's not making us safer, and it's not making Israeli communities safer, these assaults. So in the name of security, opening up space for thinking through the real foundations for Palestinian liberation, that's the only way to get to real security and safety. And a quick shout out to the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library, always a source of hope. And we're growing Jadwe watermelon in the AU Community Garden as part of a broader participatory plant breeding solidarity project with Palestine.
Thank you, Garrett.
Also, quick closing remarks here. One is that how to deal with the fear and trauma, and thank you for your intervention, the students or the person who stood there. Thank you. That was very powerful, and I connected with that. I am traumatized, as many other Palestinians, second-hand trauma, or 1.5, you want to say. We've lost over 81 people we know in Gaza. 15 people we work with for the past 15 years. We don't know where they are. All their universities destroyed. My brother works with on mental health, and he's doing online session with people of a trauma in Gaza on daily basis, and he volunteered to do that also and work with this. There's a huge demand and need for mental health to deal with the trauma of the genocide, and there is so much shortage in people to talk about that, and they don't have the infrastructure like Israel as a state to have that infrastructure to deal with it. So the need is there as well. How could we deal with that? An Israeli peace activist I used to know more in the mid-90s did not speak up. So I sent a message poking her. Where are you? And she did not respond, and then 2-3 times, and then I poked again, and then she said, there is no space in my heart to find any solidarity or compassion. And she closed herself until now. I feel very sad because we used to be very close colleagues. So I said, I've written that if you don't stand up now, you are next. Because the Ben Gvir and Smotrich, that also Michael, we both agreed on that, they're not gonna stop by the Palestinian. They're gonna continue and destroy the fabric of the Israeli society, which we already did. So if you do not stop and stand now to speak against it, you will be next. And there's already signs that there are Israeli Jews who have been assaulted, attacked, abused by this regime that exists. So it is not only your duty for Palestinian, but also for yourself. And I think that's a way to move forward, to find those voices, Palestinian and Israelis, who have a clarity about the risk and the threat that this regime constitute. And I think that's something that gives me hope, and that's something that is doable. And like many, the speaker, she spoke about Jewish Voices for Peace and other group, that's where one can find solidarity and sustenance for the vision that we are trying to push. A vision of inclusivity and not a vision that based on fear. Fear paralyzes people. And I've seen it, how people are paralyzed with the fear. They see the killing and they know it's wrong, but they're paralyzed with their fear. And I think that's where the help is needed.
All right.
My friend Maura Finkelstein was fired from her tenure-track job for speaking about Palestine. Her tenured job, excuse me. My friend Jairo Funes was put on leave for standing in solidarity with the Gaza encampment. Stephen Thrasher, a black gay man, professor of journalism, was also given leave without pay for again showing up for a Gaza encampment. So please do not tell me that there is an even playing field. Please do not tell me that Palestinian studies are funded and supported to the extent of Israeli studies and presence. That is a disingenuous even thought to start with. Palestinian voices have been systematically silenced on American university campuses for decades. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen candidates for jobs, for tenure-track jobs, being delegitimized because they're researchers on Palestine. So I agree with Elise. I completely agree that we cannot tell untruths here, and we need to speak the truth of the incredible power imbalance. And what gives me hope is Garrett and Mohammed and Anthony and Ken, that we all sat up here, even though our particular jobs could have been on the line. I saw Alan Meltzer, Board of Trustee member, here earlier today. I'm very glad he came. I wonder if there'll be an email in my box tomorrow morning. And I'm saying that to all of you right here, right now, on camera. These folks give me hope, and you all give me hope. And I'll end there. Thank you very much for coming.